Hi all. In this video we're going to be looking at race, ethnicity, and the borderlands. So we're primarily going to be investigating two concepts. The first is that of double consciousness. The essay on Piper and Simpson and Bell Hooks's essay looks at this concept. And then the second concept we'll look at is the conception of mestiza consciousness and what it is to exist in the borderlands. So looking at Anzaldua and Frida Kahlo's work. So a further note, you can refer back to the materials on critical race theory and intersectionality from earlier in the course. They go together with the material in this unit really well, and your papers should be drawing from both the materials in this unit as well as those earlier materials as you're working on those unit papers. All right, so first we're going to cover the concept of double consciousness, and it is best described in the following way. So double consciousness is a split consciousness. It's a split conception of self that occurs as a result of oppressive dominant orders. So an example of this would be the way in which a woman sees herself through her own conception of self subjectively versus the way in which she's taught to value femininity through the gaze of the other, i.e. the dominant masculinist gaze. Piper and Simpson and Hooks look at this gaze as also a racialized gaze. So they are investigating the ways in which people of color are forced to see their racialized identities from the perspectives of white peoples. So they can internalize inferiority. They may have to attempt to negotiate stereotypes, and this is a restriction on access to full composition of self or full realization or manifestation of self. A way to think of it is that men, white people, heterosexual peoples, cisgender peoples, they don't have to negotiate these stereotypes. They don't live amid stereotype threat that can function to create a context for reduction of sense of self and subjectivity as one sees oneself. So another way to think of it is as follows. Double consciousness is a split consciousness where the one component of consciousness, of this doubled consciousness, is the way that everyone sees themselves, so that subjective aspect. So in terms of my femininity, I value femininity as a woman. I see the value in traditional feminine traits. And the second part of this consciousness, of this doubled consciousness, is the view from outside. So within a masculinist culture, feminine traits are devalued. So I comport myself, even though I value my femininity, in a way that seeks to negotiate that self-value with the lack of value that surrounds me. The same thing is true in terms of race. So Piper and Simpson especially are looking at the ways in which Black people value their Blackness and assert the value of Blackness, but oftentimes have to negotiate stereotypes or lessons that teach them that Blackness isn't as valuable as whiteness. So this creates a context in which self-representation, access to self, manifestation of self-value is oftentimes reduced within public and dominant spaces. So it is, another way to think of it is, it's learning to see the self through the gaze of the dominant other. So women learn to see themselves as or through the way in which men see them. People of color learn to see themselves through the way in which they're framed as lacking whiteness, or through the way in which white people see them. Same-sex oriented people comport themselves and can learn to see themselves through the way in which a heterosexual culture frames them. And so this creates a context where, again, access to social freedom, political freedom, economic freedom can be reduced. So Another example of this is the doll study in psychology. So this is an infamous study that has been repeated multiple times throughout the past 4 or 5 decades, where you have black and white girls given 2 dolls. One is a black doll, one is a white doll, and all study participants tend to choose the white doll as the good or desirable doll and map positive qualities onto this white representative doll. This is even the black girls. So it shows the extent to which the internalization of anti-black racist norms occurs, or it is embedded throughout the entirety of culture. It's not just something that white people learn, but rather people of color also, in that they live amid anti-black racist norms, internalize the goodness of whiteness and the badness of blackness. So it's a learning to see the self and one's value through the lens of the dominant group, and that functions to create a context again of reduction of self or value of self. However, there can be freedom in developing a feminist or an anti-racist consciousness through looking back at racist or sexist or heterosexist norms within dominant culture. So Hooks's essay looks at stereotypes like the Jezebel, like the Sapphire, like the Mammy, but inevitably Hooks argues that there can be solidarity built between black women spectators through developing a confrontational gaze. So the black women that Hooks covers in her essay don't internalize the devaluing or undervaluing of blackness, of black femininity specifically, but rather they laugh at the stereotypes, or they critically analyze the stereotypes. And Hooks's essay also investigates or analyzes the way in which black men can also internalize the devaluing of black femininity. So here you see intersectionality at the forefront as well. So black men, as they are men, do derive some sort of gain through patriarchal culture. This doesn't mean that black men don't experience oppression, but rather when we use intersectionality, we can provide a more nuanced understanding of discrepancies in power between oppressed groups. So in the same way that white women derive benefit within an anti-black racist society through the fact that they are white, black men derive benefit within a patriarchal context or culture in that they are men. And they can utilize the stereotypes of black women that pervade anti-black racist and sexist cultures against black women. And this creates a context for the re-invoking or the reinforcing of power discrepancies that are gender-based within black families, within black communities, etc. So again, for Hooks, the development of a critical gaze can be empowering. That word tends to be overused, but it can create a context for the invoking or the initiative to bind oneself or to engage in solidarity with other black women as a black woman as you engage in this kind of development of a critical consciousness. Now it's important to note that this critical consciousness isn't automatic. All black women aren't born with this critical consciousness, but rather it's something that has to be developed. It has to be developed within a shared social world. It has to, in a sense, has to be access to this critical consciousness, and then it has to be chosen. So the idea that this is a natural gaze is not part of Hooks's argument, but rather it's something that has to be worked for. There has to be a moment of deconstruction that can be followed then by that choice for solidarity. So pay attention to the way in which the artworks of Piper, Simpson, and Kahlo function to produce the deconstructive moment that enables the development of this critical gaze, and then introduce a critical gaze through their work as well. All right, so the second dominant theme within Unit 5 is that of the mestiza consciousness, or within this unit is the mestiza consciousness. So mestiza consciousness that Anzaldua theorizes in her famous text, The Borderlands, is a feminist consciousness, and it's specifically a feminist consciousness both in terms of its ability to deconstruct dominant modes of knowing or gazing, but also in terms of the way in which it seeks to eliminate the necessity of the either-or structuring of identity. So it embraces the both and, which is a feminist mode of knowing generally, and which functions to create a context where in which both persons, identities, don't have to be objected in order to create the context for like straight lines of subjectivity. So recall in Unit 3, we discussed the ways in which, Unit 3 and 4, we discussed the ways in which in order for one to appear as an I, as a subject, one has to be gendered according to normative conscriptions of gender identity. So one has to be cisgender, and one has to be a cisgender man or a cisgender woman, and sexually oriented in a straight way to appear within a heteronormative world as a subject at all. So Anzaldua is going to use this conception as well, but she's going to add to it a racialized conception and a colonial conception. So for a subject to appear as a subject, as an I, one has to be both white and one has to be European. So mixed identities, mestiza identities, do not appear as subjective perspectives within an anti-Black racist and within a colonialist landscape. So these identities that are mixed or that are indigenous or that are Black or brown are abjected, are cast out in order to maintain the value of and the superiority of whiteness and European identities. So Anzaldua, who personally is born in the borderlands, quite literally, on the border of Mexico and the United States, and who speaks a hybrid language, multiple hybrid languages as you move through her essay, reveals the way in which there's a linguistic straightness that oftentimes dominates the conceptions of subjectivity within anti-Black racist and anti-brown worlds as well. And this creates a context wherein which through the utilization of colonial languages, which Spanish is also a colonial language, and this is something that Kahlo is going to introduce. So when Frida Kahlo's work invokes Aztec history or a pre-Columbian conception of Mexican peoples, or invokes the Zapotec women, or creates a context for reference to indigenous peoples of the Americas. This creates a context for looking back at the colonial practices of the Spaniards. So Spanish is also a colonial language in the United States, where a lot of the anti-immigrant and anti-Mexican language that dominates is also around language and is anti-Spanish. We tend to forget this, but Spanish is also a colonial language. The peoples of Mexico, of Central America, of South America, what we refer to as Mexico, South America, and Central America today, also were colonized, and they were colonized not by Great Britain, but by Spanish conquistadors. So Anzaldua points out this as well, that conceptions of Mexican peoples that are bore out through Spanish, Kahlo points this out as well, conceptions of Mexican peoples that are bore out through Spanish are also conceptions that occur through a colonialist lens. So what is it to attempt to trace one's roots back to indigenous roots prior to the colonial moment of conquest? But the more central point of Anzaldua's work that will also apply to Kahlo's work is that there can be a construction of sense of self for hybrid identities that don't require a conception of self through binary opposition. So one doesn't have to conceive of self as either or. One can conceive of self as both and. And so this framing, this mestiza consciousness framing, enables a more complex consideration of existence and a more nuanced understanding of identity, and especially of identities that are typically abjected. So identities that are typically abjected are both those that are cast as inferior, but also those that don't line up according to the straight standards of the superior-inferior either-or dichotomy. So in terms of sexual orientation, an example of this would be bisexuality. In terms of racialized identity, examples of this would be multiracial peoples. You're going to see Piper discuss this. So Piper is a light-skinned black woman, and as a light-skinned black woman, she oftentimes experiences colorism or the effects of colorism within black communities, and she experiences anti-black racism when white people find out that she is black. Other examples of this include considerations of gender identity, so non-binary identities, gender-queer persons, agender persons, etc. So they exist outside of the typical constructions of the either-or structuring of the masculine and the feminine, and thus have to be abjected or cast out in order to create the context for the reinforcement of the straight ordering of gender, which in effect ends up benefiting the superior caste. So the idea is that the mestiza, in that it can encompass multiple identities, it enables a rejection of the either-or structuring of identity, can function to deconstruct or disintegrate the binary itself. So through the inclusion of hybrid or mixed or multiplicity in terms of identity, it creates a context for the breakdown of the either-or structuring itself. It shows that to have never really existed, but rather to be a product of oppressive ordering itself, because the function is of either-or structuring is to create a context for the uplifting of the superior caste. All right, so pay attention to this in the excerpt from the Borderlands from Anzaldua, and pay attention to the way in which in the lecture notes this emphasis on choosing the both exists as well, and how this creates the context for the construction of a different kind of meaning, a meaning that is feminist, a meaning that is nuanced, a meaning that encompasses value in multiple forms, that doesn't require value in one way, but can create a context for pluralism and value and valuing. All right, so that's it for this lecture video. Just a note about your papers. One of the options is to write about the works of art of Piper, Simpson, or Kahlo. Many students choose to write about Frida Kahlo's work, maybe because they have heard of Frida Kahlo. The problem is that many of these papers contain the problems in terms of interpretation that are pointed to within this unit. So Helen's essay that you will read this unit looks at the ways in which Kahlo's work has been read through a sexist, racist, and colonialist lens. And this produces misinterpretations of Kahlo's work. But many of the papers that are submitted in this unit oftentimes reproduce the sexism, racism, and colonialist framework, or the sexist, racist, and colonialist framework. So if you Google Kahlo's work and you're trying to write your paper based upon the interpretations of Kahlo's work that you have Googled, you are going to definitely repeat these problems. So you need to make sure you're using course materials, or that you're using scholarship on Kahlo that is explicitly feminine, or feminist, not feminine, feminist, because this will offer an accurate reading of Kahlo. So many of the inaccurate readings reduce her work to merely the personal, especially her personal life, personal trauma, or infidelity in her marriage, and these are misinterpretations of her work. So use Helen's essay to interpret, also use the lecture notes to interpret, And then if you use outside sources, make sure you're using feminist scholarship that functions to read Kahlo's work as explicitly political and not merely personal. So even though feminist activism shows that there is a politics to the personal, feminist work does not reduce feminist art to merely the personal. There's a difference there. There's nuance there. All right, so again, don't Google. You will not find nuanced analysis through Googling Kahlo's work. This is generally true, Googling any feminist artist that appears in this course. All right, have a good week.